Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you're new here, this channel is where men come to tell their stories after the Philippines has finished teaching them something. Sometimes they lost money, sometimes they lost more than that. Today's story involves both. The man you're about to hear from is Brendan. He's 59 years old, Irish, from a small town in County Roscommon. He spent 40 years as a roofer. Not managing roofers, not owning a roofing company, just up on the rooftops himself, day after day, in the kind of weather that would keep most people indoors. He's not a complicated man. He worked hard, he loved his wife, and when she died, he found himself with a lump of money and no idea what to do with either himself or it. He ended up in the Philippines. He ended up building something there. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I'm going to tell you this straight, and I'm not going to dress it up. I'm 59 years of age. I've got bad knees, and a face that's taken 40 Irish winters. And the last thing I want is to sit here and have people feeling sorry for me. So if that's what you're waiting for, you've come to the wrong video. What I want is for you to understand the state I was in. Because that matters. The state a man is in matters to everything that comes after it. I started in roofing when I was 18, followed my uncle into it, which is how most lads fell into trades back then. Roscommon, this is. Not exactly the building capital of the world, but there was work if you knew where to look. And I did. 41 years I was at it, on and off. Residential mostly, houses, extensions, the odd commercial job when things were quiet. I'm not going to romanticize it. It was hard work. It was cold work. It was work that gets into your knees and your lower back and stays there. But I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it, and that's not nothing. Mary and the first met when we were both 27. She was a receptionist at a doctor's surgery in town. We got talking at a mutual friend's birthday thing, and that was that, really. 31 years together. No children, not by design, just how it went, and we made our peace with it a long time before the end. We had a terrace house on the edge of town, small garden front and back. She kept the front one nice. I kept saying I'd do something with the back, and I never quite did. She died on a Tuesday in March 2021. I was watching the football. She was in the other room folding laundry. And then, and there's no graceful way to say this, she just wasn't there anymore. Heart attack. The paramedics were very kind. The doctor said she wouldn't have felt anything. Or at least that's what they tell you. I don't know if it's true. I choose to think it is. I'm telling you this, not because I want you to feel anything about it, but because you need to know what that house became after. It became the loudest place I'd ever been in my life, and there was nothing in it making any noise. I lasted 18 months, long enough that people stopped bringing food around. Long enough that her clothes weren't in the wardrobe anymore. Long enough that the garden she kept at the front had gone to seed, and I'd stopped caring about it. My sister Margaret, in Athlone, kept ringing. My mate Desi, from work, took me to the pub on a fairly regular basis, which helped and didn't help in equal measure. The lads were good, but there's a limit to what other people can do. I sold the house in September 2022. I told Desi it made financial sense now that it was just me. I told Margaret I needed a change of scenery. I told myself, and I genuinely believed this, which is the important part. One, told myself I wasn't running. I was reorganizing. There's a difference. I'm still not entirely sure which one it was. The house sold for a bit, over €300,000, which sounds like a lot, and is a lot, but after paying off what was left on the mortgage and the solicitor's fees, and one thing and another, I walked away with somewhere around $155,000. not a fortune. Enough to be careful with. Enough to be stupid with, as it turned out, though I didn't know that yet. I found the Philippines the way I'm guessing a lot of men my age find it. Facebook, late at night, when you can't sleep and you've already watched everything worth watching. There was a group, something like Retiring Abroad on a Budget, some name like that, and it was full of lads posting photographs of themselves in the sunshine. Pints of San Miguel on beachfronts. Meals that cost less than a cup of coffee back home. Monthly living expenses broken down to the cent, and all of them looking about 15 years younger than they had any right to. I want to be honest about what I was looking for, because I've thought about this a lot. I wasn't looking for a woman. Hand on heart, that was not the plan. What I was looking for was somewhere the silence was a different kind. In Roscommon, the silence had 31 years of Mary in it. Every room, every street, every face I knew. I wanted to be somewhere nobody knew me, somewhere the quiet was just quiet, and not an absence of something specific. I chose the Philippines over other places for a fairly unglamorous reason. There was a man in the Facebook group from Athlone. I won't name him, but I knew who he was, knew the family slightly, and he'd been living in a place called Dumaguete for 3 years. Posted regularly. Seemed genuine, not like he was selling anything. I messaged him, and he replied within the hour. Spent about 40 minutes on a video call with me, answered every question I had, told me what it actually cost to live there, what the health system was like, what the other expats were like. Said it wasn't for everyone, but it had been right for him. I trust that kind of thing more than brochures. I booked a flight for November 2022. 6 weeks, tourist visa, small guest house near the boulevard that the Athlone man had recommended. Just to see. No commitments, no plans beyond that. I genuinely believed that. The flight over is about 18 hours with the stopover. I remember sitting in Dubai airport at some terrible time of the morning eating a ham sandwich and thinking, you're 58 years old and you're going somewhere you've never been, and you don't know a single person there, and Mary would find this absolutely hilarious. She had a good sense of humor, Mary. Very dry. She'd have said something like, well, at least you'll get a bit of heat for once. I arrived in Dumaguete on a Tuesday, which I noticed. Some days are like that now. The heat hit me immediately coming out of the terminal, the way it does when you're not expecting it. Not oppressive. Well, actually, a bit oppressive, but different from how I'd imagined it. Thicker. The kind of air that makes you feel like you have to push through it slightly. There were tricycles everywhere outside the terminal, these little motorbikes with sidecars attached, and they were all tooting, and the drivers were all calling out. And I found my driver for the guest house, and got in, and sat there watching Dumaguete go past the window. It wasn't what I'd been picturing. It was smaller, more ordinary. There were basketball courts every 200 meters, which I later found out is completely standard across the whole country. Sari-sari stores on every corner, these tiny little shop fronts selling single sachets of shampoo and individual cigarettes and ice in plastic bags. Roosters, a lot of roosters, and a smell that I can only describe as a mixture of exhaust fumes and something being cooked over charcoal. And underneath that, every so often, the ocean. I want to say it felt like coming home, but that would be the wrong word. And I promised you I'd tell this straight. It felt like arriving somewhere, which, after 2 years of not quite being anywhere, was already something. The first visit was 6 weeks, November into December 2022. I want to be clear about something before I tell you about Rowena, because it matters to the story. I did not go to the Philippines looking for a woman. I know that's what men say. I know half the people watching this are nodding along thinking, yeah, that's what they all say. But I mean it in a specific way. I wasn't avoiding it either. I was just genuinely indifferent to it, which is a different thing. When you've been with someone for 31 years and then they're gone, the idea of starting that whole thing again from scratch doesn't fill you with excitement. It fills you with exhaustion. So romance wasn't the plan. A bit of warmth and a lower cost of living was the plan. The guest house was on a side street off the Dumaguete Boulevard, about a 5-minute walk from the waterfront. Small place. 8 rooms, a little dining area where they served breakfast each morning, usually pandesal and some eggs, sometimes sinangag, which is fried rice with garlic, and I developed a fondness for that I wasn't expecting. The woman who ran it was in her 60s, very businesslike, very efficient. The front desk was usually handled by her niece, or, about half the time, by a woman named Rowena. I didn't pay much attention to Rowena that first visit. That's the honest answer. She was there. She was pleasant. She checked me in and checked me out, and answered questions about where to get a SIM card and whether the boulevard was safe to walk at night, which it is, largely. She had a quiet way of speaking. Not shy exactly, just economical. Said what was needed and left the rest. I noticed that, in passing. I'm like that myself. Dumaguete suited me. I want to say that plainly because I think it's relevant. The city genuinely suited me. It's not Cebu, which is all flyovers and malls and traffic that doesn't move. It's not Boracay, which I visited for 4 days and found to be absolute madness. Lovely beach, but wall-to-wall everything. Dumaguete is smaller. It's a university town. Silliman University is right there in the middle of it, and that gives the place a different energy. Younger and more settled at the same time, if that makes sense. The boulevard runs along the sea, and people walk it in the evenings. Families and couples, and old men feeding pigeons. I walked it most evenings myself. Nobody bothered me. People were curious, but not pushy. I spent the 6 weeks doing very little, which was the point. I rented a bicycle for a week and got lost on it. I ate at a carinderia near the market 2 or 3 times a week. They did a sinigang there, pork ribs in that sour tamarind broth that I still think about. I had San Miguel on the waterfront in the evenings and watched the sun go down over Negros Oriental and thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time in 2 years I'd managed that. I went home for Christmas, spent it with Margaret in Athlone. She asked what the Philippines was like, and I said warm, and she said, that was it. Was that all I had to say? And I said it was also cheap, and she looked at me the way she does. I booked the return flight in January, 2nd visit. That was the plan. Go back for longer. Get a proper sense of whether I could live there. That 2nd visit I went back to the same guest house. Partly habit, partly I knew the area by then, partly, and I may as well admit this, the pandesal was very good. Rowena was at the desk when I checked in. She remembered me, which I found mildly surprising. Remembered my name. Remembered that I'd had trouble with the air conditioning in the first room, and been moved. Asked if I'd prefer a different room from the start this time. Small things. But she'd held on to them. We started talking properly about 2 weeks into that 2nd visit. It happened gradually and without any great intention on either side, as far as I could tell. I'd come down in the evenings and she'd be finishing her shift, and we'd end up talking at the desk for 20 minutes, half an hour. She was 51. Widowed. Her husband had died 6 years before. Some kind of illness. She didn't say what, and I didn't ask. She had a daughter, Maribel, who was 26 and working in a call center in Cebu City. She had her mother down in Bayawan, about an hour south by bus. She was from there originally and had come up to Dumaguete for the work years ago. She was Catholic the way people in that country often are, which is to say genuinely and without making a performance of it. She mentioned going to Mass on Sundays the way someone might mention going for a walk, just part of what she did. I went with her once, about a month in. Not because she asked me to, she didn't. I offered, and she seemed pleased, but not overwhelmed by it. The church was down near the market, one of those old Spanish colonial ones, with the thick walls and the ceiling fans and the saints in their glass cases. I understood about a quarter of the service, which was in Filipino and Latin in roughly equal measure, and I sat beside her and felt, I don't know, present. That's the word. Present in a way I hadn't quite been anywhere in a while. I want to say one thing about that first month with Rowena, because I've thought about it a great deal since, and I want to be fair to what it actually was. She never once asked me for money. Not directly, not indirectly, not through any of the methods I'd read about in the Facebook group where lads warned each other about this thing and that thing. Not a hint of it. She didn't ask what I did for a living for the first 2 weeks, which I mentioned earlier was significant to me, because every time I'd described myself as a retired roofer from Roscommon to someone in that country, I could see them doing the arithmetic. Foreigner plus retired plus older equals money. And it changes how people talk to you. Rowena didn't do that arithmetic, or if she did, she kept it well hidden. Either way, the result was that we just talked. About ordinary things. Her daughter. My work, when I did eventually describe it, which she found interesting in a way people generally don't. She asked sensible questions about how you waterproofed around chimneys, of all things, because her mother's house had a problem with one. Her mother's house had a leaking roof. I think about that now, of course. I think about it quite specifically. But that was later. In those first weeks, it was just 2 people in the same category. Both of us on the far side of losing someone, both of us not quite sure what shape life was supposed to take now, and finding it easier to talk to each other than either of us had expected. That's what it was. I'm certain that's what it was. Whether it was enough to justify what came next is a different question. The roof situation came up on a Wednesday evening, about 5 weeks into the second visit. We'd fallen into a kind of routine by then. Rowena finished her shift at 6, and if I happened to be around, which, let's be honest, I usually was, we'd walk down to the boulevard together and get something to eat. There was a carinderia about 3 minutes from the guest house, run by a woman named Nena, and they did a chicken adobo there that was the best thing I'd eaten in either visit. Dark and sticky and sour all at once. We ate there most evenings. Nena knew our order after 2 weeks. Anyway, Wednesday evening, we're walking back from Nena's, and Rowena mentions almost as an aside that her mother's house in Bayawan has a problem with one of the chimneys. Water coming in every time it rains. Has been for a year or so. She says it matter-of-factly, the way she says most things, not as a request or a complaint, just as a piece of information that happened to be relevant to something we'd been talking about. And look, I know how this sounds. I know exactly how this sounds. But I'm a roofer. A leaking chimney is the kind of problem I spent 40 years fixing. I asked her what the situation was, whether it was the flashing or the mortar or what, and she described it well enough that I could picture it. And it was almost certainly the lead flashing gone around the base of the stack. 15 years of tropical heat and wet season rain will do that. I said I'd cover the cost of fixing it. She said no immediately. Said I didn't have to do that. I said it was a roofing problem, and I knew about roofing problems, and it was fine. She said she'd think about it. She came back 2 days later and said her cousin knew a builder in Bayawan, and the estimate was P45,000, which is roughly $720. She looked uncomfortable accepting it. She actually looked uncomfortable. I gave her the cash from an ATM on Purtice's Street, and she said thank you and didn't make a big thing of it. And neither did I. That was it. That was the first money. And before anyone says it, yes, I know. But I want you to sit with the specifics of it, because it wasn't her asking me for her rent, or her mother's medicine, or any of the things you read about in those Facebook warnings. It was a leaking roof, and a retired roofer happened to be standing there. That's a genuine thing that happened. It doesn't make the rest of what happened any smarter, but it was genuinely what it was. Here's what I noticed, though, and I noticed it at the time, not just now. She didn't bring it up again. She said the builder had fixed it, and her mother was pleased, and that was it. No follow-up request. No other problem that suddenly needed solving. No mention of the mother needing anything else. 3 weeks went by and she never mentioned money of any kind. I was paying for our dinners at Nana's, which wasn't a fortune, maybe $300 or P400 for two, about 5 to 6. And she'd occasionally try to pay herself and I'd wave her off. But that was just normal. That was what happened when two people ate together, and one of them had considerably more money than the other. The money I wasn't spending was something I thought about quite a bit during those months, actually. I'd come from a house sale in Roscommon with roughly $155,000 in a bank account, and after flights and 2 months of guest house accommodation and daily expenses in a city where everything was cheap, I'd barely made a dent in it. I was also drawing the Irish state pension, which gave me about $100 a month. In Dumaguete, that went an enormous distance. My rent for the first monthly apartment I took, a small place near the university, air conditioning, hot water, quiet street, was $18,000 a month, about $285, including the electricity. That's what I mean about the numbers. I mention this because I want you to understand the psychology of it. When you have money you're not spending, and you're living well below your means, and there's a woman next to you at dinner who sends half her modest guest house salary home to a mother with a leaking chimney. The pressure isn't coming from her. It's coming from the mathematics of the situation, and from something in yourself that wants to be useful. About 3 months in, I started covering our shared meals and activities more formally. Not as an allowance, that word never came up between us, but I'd take care of the bill when we were out, and if she needed something, I'd handle it. Maybe P12,000 to P15,000 a month, all told, about $190, $240. What that money actually did was free up her salary to send more home to Bayawan. I understood that. I wasn't naive about it. I just decided it was something I could afford, and that it made her life easier, and those two things felt like enough. I also understood, by this point, something about the cultural reality I was operating in. One of the other long-term expats in Dumaguete, a Scotsman named Bill who'd been there 4 years, married to a woman from Cebu, had explained it to me plainly over a San Miguel one evening at the Hayahay bar. He said that here, your partner's family is your family. Full stop. Not metaphorically, actually. Supporting her mother isn't generosity, it's obligation. And the measure of a man, in the way a lot of people here see it, is whether he carries that obligation without complaint. He wasn't telling me this as a warning exactly, more as a thing you had to decide about in advance, before you got in deep enough that deciding was no longer available to you. I thought I'd decided. That's the honest answer. I thought about it, and I decided I was comfortable with that kind of obligation, in principle. I'm Irish. We understand family obligation. We understand duty and guilt, and the weight of what you owe the people who raised you. It didn't seem like a foreign concept. It seemed like something I could work with. What I didn't properly account for was the difference between understanding something in principle and living inside it in practice. And I definitely didn't account for the way that principle can expand, slowly and with perfect logic, until it covers things you never originally signed up for. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The point is that in those early months, nothing alarmed me. She was careful with money in a way that seemed genuine. She was direct about her family obligations without making them my problem. The relationship was good. Simple and good. We were two older people who'd both lost someone and found it easier to breathe near each other than separately. There are worse foundations than that. There are also, as it turned out, worse things you can build on them. The house idea was mine. I want to be completely clear about that because it matters to how I think about the whole thing now. It came from a combination of factors, none of which had anything to do with Rowena specifically. There was a lad in the expat Facebook group, American, from Arizona, retired, who'd posted a detailed breakdown of what he'd built outside Dumaguete. 3-bedroom house, decent size, tiled throughout, proper bathroom, covered porch, small garden wall, total cost including land, around P4.2 million. He'd done it 2 years prior. Posted photos. Looked solid. I messaged him, and he replied with the name of the contractor he'd used and a general overview of the process, the timeline, what to watch for. He seemed happy with the result. Around the same time, I'd started looking at what monthly renting was going to cost me if I stayed in Dumaguete long-term. A decent apartment, not fancy, just clean and quiet, was running P18,000 to $25,000 a month. $285, $400. Over 5 or 10 years, that's a lot of money going out with nothing to show for it. And I'm a builder. I don't think in terms of renting by default. I think in terms of what a thing costs to build versus what it costs to maintain, and which makes more sense over the long run. So the idea wasn't romantic. It was, or felt, logical. I mentioned it to Rowena one evening, casually, the way you'd mention any idea you were turning over. Said I'd been thinking about whether it made more sense to build something rather than rent indefinitely. What did she think about that? And she said, and this is the thing I've replayed a lot, she said it was a big decision, that I should take my time, that it was my money, and I shouldn't rush it on anyone's account. Anyone's account. She didn't say her account. She said anyone's. I'm not saying that was calculated. I genuinely don't know if it was. But I can tell you the effect it had. It removed any resistance I might have felt. Every other piece of the internet will tell you what you want to hear. She was telling me to slow down. Somehow, that made me want to go faster. I looked at land for about 6 weeks. A couple of expats I'd met at a bar on Real Street pointed me toward an area about 4 kilometers north of the city center, a barangay where a few foreigners had already built, which meant the local government was familiar with the process and less likely to make it complicated. The land I eventually bought was modest, about 250 square meters, enough for a single-story house with a small garden front and back. A corner lot, which I liked. Good drainage. I could see it was well drained just from looking at the soil composition and the slope of it. Some things you know. Now, here is the part one want to explain carefully, because it's the part people always go straight to as evidence I was an Egypt. The land went into Rowena's name. I knew, before I ever started looking, that foreigners cannot own land in the Philippines, not a condominium in a building with enough foreign buyers to meet the quota. Yes. Land? No. The law is very clear on this. So I'd read about the options. A long-term lease, a corporation structure, or putting it in a partner's name. The corporation structure requires a Filipino majority shareholder and is complicated and expensive to set up and maintain. The lease option gives you security for 25 years, extendable, but you don't own anything and the terms can be contested. The partner option is the simplest and also the most legally exposed. I understood the risk. I want to be very honest about that. I understood the risk, and I decided to accept it because I trusted her, and because the numbers made the other options look overcomplicated for what I was trying to do. I think about that decision quite a bit now, whether it was naive or just unlucky. I haven't quite settled on an answer. The land purchase was $1.1 million, about $17,500. We used a local lawyer in Dumaguete, a woman who handled property transfers fairly regularly for expats, someone Bill the Scotsman had used and recommended. The transfer took about 6 weeks, which is normal. The title came out in Rowena's name. I have a copy of the deed. My name appears nowhere on it. Construction started in June 2023. The contractor was the same one the Arizona man had recommended, a local fellow named Edgar who ran a small outfit of maybe 12 workers. I liked him immediately. He was practical, didn't oversell, gave me a timeline and stuck roughly to it. And when I asked technical questions about the build, he answered them properly, rather than just telling me what I wanted to hear. We had a few conversations about the roof specifically, the type of purlins, the pitch, whether to go with GI sheets or clay tiles. I went with clay tiles, heavier but better insulation, and they last considerably longer in that climate. Edgar agreed. We got on well. The build budget was $2.1 million for the structure, roughly $33,500, with payments staged across the construction. 30% up front, 30% at wall plate level, 30% when the roof was on, 10% on completion. Standard enough. I visited the site every few days while it was going up. That was the part of all this that felt most like me. Walking a construction site. Watching something become real from the ground up. Seeing problems before they became expensive. I spotted a drainage issue with the foundation footing in week 3 that would have caused trouble later. Edgar fixed it without a word of argument. By August, the walls were up. By October, the roof was on. I stood under it one afternoon when Edgar's crew had knocked off for the day. Just stood there in the empty shell of the place in the late heat, with the sound of tricycles coming from the road, and someone's karaoke starting up about 200 meters away. And I thought, I built this. Well, I paid for it, and knew what I was looking at while it was built, which for a roofer from Roscommon is near enough the same thing. Rowena came with me to the site that day. She walked the room slowly, touching the walls. Didn't say much. She did say she liked the tiles I'd chosen for the bathroom, which were a plain cream color, nothing fancy. She said her mother would like the garden area. Her mother would like the garden area. I noted that. I didn't act on it. One told myself it was a natural thing to say. In this country, your family are part of everything. You don't build something without imagining your family in it. That's not suspicious. That's just how people are here. I still think that's true, actually. I just think I didn't understand what it fully meant yet. The house was finished in late October 2023. Edgar's crew did the final touches, grouting the last of the bathroom tiles, hanging the gate on the perimeter fence, painting the exterior walls a pale yellow that Rowena had chosen from a color card at Gaisano Mall. I'd have gone with white. She said yellow was more welcoming. I said fine. The additional spend came in stages, each one feeling reasonable on its own. Generator first, the power in that part of Dumaguete went out regularly during wet season, sometimes for hours, and without a generator, the fridge would cycle off, and the fans would stop, and the heat would sit on you like a physical weight. A decent Yamaha unit ran us $85,000, about $1,260. Then kitchen appliances, a refrigerator, a gas range, a washing machine, a water purifier mounted on the kitchen wall. 120,000 in total, roughly 1,920 from a shop on Rizal Boulevard where the salesman spoke excellent English and threw in free delivery and installation. Security grills on all the windows, standard in that country, everyone has them. Another $35,000, 560. The perimeter fence concrete cap and the gate itself, which Edgar quoted and completed, P40,000 more. And various smaller things, curtains, a dining table, a bed frame and mattress, a sofa that I paid too much for at SM City because Rowena liked the color of it. All told, the fittings and furnishings came to P480,000, about $7,680 on top of everything else. I'm not going to pretend those numbers didn't land on me. They did. I sat with a spreadsheet one evening and added it all up. Land at P1.1 million, construction at P2.1 million, then the P480,000 in additions, plus the P45,000 roof repair, and 14 months of covering shared meals and day-to-day expenses. Call that $200,000 all in. Total outlay, close to $3.9 million, about $62,000 of the $155,000 I'd walked away from Roscommon with. I still had $93,000 in the bank. I was drawing my Irish pension at $100 a month, which in Dumaguete meant I could live on the pension alone if I was sensible about it. The savings were intact. By any measure I could defend to myself, I hadn't done anything reckless. That was what I told myself anyway. Rowena left the guest house job in September. I want to be clear. I didn't ask her to, and she didn't do it because of me specifically. The owner was retiring, the niece was taking over, and there were changes to the shift structure that Rowena didn't want to deal with. She'd been there 11 years. It was a natural ending point. She said she'd look for something else after the house was finished and things settled. I said there was no rush. She was drawing on her savings for the time being. She had some. We moved into the house in early November. 3 weeks together in it before I had to go back to Ireland. Those 3 weeks. I've thought about them a great deal. The morning routine was the one I remember most clearly. I'd wake early. You always wake early in that country. The roosters see to that. There was 2 houses down that started at around 4 in the morning and had no intention of stopping. And I'd make porridge on the gas range, which Rowena found baffling. She'd watch me making it as if I were performing some strange Northern European ritual. She'd have sinangag and an egg. We'd sit on the covered porch with the garden in front of us, still mostly bare earth at that point, a few plants she'd put in along the fence, and drink coffee and watch the street wake up. Tricycles starting their rounds. The Sari Sari store across the road pulling up its shutter. Kids in school uniforms walking past in 2s and 3s. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. And I know that sounds like nothing. But after 3 years of mornings in Roscommon that felt like the inside of a room that nobody was ever coming back to, ordinary was. It was considerable. Rodel appeared during that 3rd week. Rowena's younger brother. 38, 3 kids, wife who worked part-time at a market stall in Bayawan. He'd been doing construction labor, but the site he was on had shut down. The developer had run out of money, apparently. Common enough story. And he was between things. He came up from Bayawan on a bus and turned up one afternoon while I was at the site doing a final walkthrough with Edgar about a small punch list of items. When I got home, Rodel was sitting in my living room on the sofa Rowena had liked, watching a basketball game on the television I'd bought, drinking a Coke. Rowena introduced us. He shook my hand and called me Kuya, which is a respectful term for an older man. Literally, it means older brother. He seemed friendly, a bit loud in the way that some people are loud when they're uncertain of their welcome. He stayed for dinner, and then stayed the night, sleeping on the sofa, and then he was still there the following morning. I didn't say anything. I should have, probably. Not rudely, just asked what the plan was. But I didn't know enough yet about how these things worked, and Rowena seemed unbothered by his presence, and I didn't want to be the Kano who didn't understand how families operated here. I'd been told, by Bill, by others, that in Filipino households, family arriving and staying is normal. Expected even. You don't send your brother to a hotel when you have a sofa. He left after 4 days. I was quietly relieved, and I felt a bit small about being quietly relieved. And then I got on with things. My flight home was November 14th. Margaret had been patient, but increasingly pointed in her messages, asking when I was coming back to sort things, asking whether I was actually planning to live there now, asking questions I mostly deflected. There was also an ongoing issue with Mary's estate, a small account at AIB and Roscommon that had residual funds I needed to appear in person to finalize, and a query from my solicitor about the house sale documentation. Things that needed a body present, not a phone call. I told Rowena I'd be back for Christmas, December 26th, I said. She saw me off at the airport in a grab car we'd booked the night before. It was raining. It rains constantly there in November, the tail end of wet season, and the roads were the way they get when it rains. Puddles becoming temporary ponds, the drainage system doing its best and losing. I had one bag. I'd left most of what I needed in the house. At the departures gate, I looked back once. She was standing near the entrance, not waving, just watching me go. That quietness she had, that was always the thing about her. I don't know what she was thinking. I've stopped pretending I do. Ireland in November is a particular kind of grim. Not dramatic grim, not storms and high seas and all that. Just gray. Low gray sky sitting on top of gray fields, and a cold that isn't especially cold, but gets into you anyway because it's wet, and the days ending at 4:30 in the afternoon. I'd forgotten. Or maybe I'd just stopped noticing when I lived there and only noticed the contrast now. Margaret fed me well, I'll say that. I stayed with her in Athlone for the first week, sleeping in the spare room, which smelled of the lavender bags she keeps in all the wardrobes. She asked about the Philippines. I told her some of it. The house, the build, Dumaguete generally. I didn't go into detail about Rowena. Not because I was hiding it, more because I knew what Margaret would do with the information, and I wasn't in the mood for it. She's a good woman, but she has opinions, and she shares them at length. I sorted the bank account in the first week. Solicitor query the week after. Both simpler than expected. A few signatures, a couple of forms, a brief conversation with a young woman at AIB who called me sir and looked approximately 19 years old. The whole business that had seemed to require my presence was done in 10 days, rather than the 5 or 6 weeks I'd originally planned for. And then it was the 3rd week of November, and I had nothing left to do in Ireland, except sit in Margaret's spare room with the lavender and the gray sky. And I found I was thinking about the porch, the covered porch at the house, and the mornings on it, and the coffee, and the rooster from 2 doors down. And I thought, I could change my flight. I want to be careful about how I describe this decision, because I've heard the voice in my head saying it was some kind of instinct, some warning I was picking up on subconsciously. I don't think that's true. I don't think there was anything instinctive about it. I just missed the place. That's all it was. I missed the warmth and the routine and the porch and, yes, I missed Rowena. And the solicitor's business was done, and Margaret had her own life to be getting on with. So I booked an earlier flight. December 19th instead of the 26th. A week early. I messaged Rowena to say the paperwork had finished sooner than expected, and I'd see her in a few days. She replied with a smiley face, and said she'd make sure the fridge was stocked. Normal. Just normal. I landed in Dumaguete at about 7 in the evening, local time. Took a grab from the small airport. About $250, which is around $4, the same way it always was. One of the things I liked about that place, the fares didn't seem to change. It was a warm evening. After a month of Irish November, the heat when you step off the plane feels like the building is malfunctioning. Within about 2 minutes of landing, you're sweating, and within 5, you've stopped minding. We pulled up outside the house at about 9 o'clock. I saw the lights on through the perimeter fence. I saw 2 motorcycles parked outside that weren't mine. I heard, faintly, a television. I want to tell you I had a bad feeling. I didn't. Motorcycles outside a house in the Philippines means nothing. Neighbors visit, family comes by. It's a sociable country. I opened the gate with my key and walked up the path toward the front door. And as I got closer, I could hear voices through the open louvered window, and I could hear what was on the television, which was a basketball game, and there was a smell coming from the kitchen of rice and something frying. I knocked on my own front door. That detail is going to sound strange. I knocked on my own front door because there were people inside, and I didn't want to just walk in on them. Rowena opened it, the look on her face. That's the thing I keep coming back to. It wasn't shock, or not just shock. It was something more prepared than shock, like a person who has been carrying something and has just been asked to put it down in front of everyone. Rodel was in the living room. His wife, Gina, was in the kitchen. Their youngest child, maybe 3 years old, was asleep on my sofa. The 2 teenage boys, Rodel's sons, from what I gathered, was an earlier relationship, though no one had ever mentioned them before, were sitting on the floor, watching the basketball. And in the second bedroom, the door slightly ajar, was Rowena's mother. I could see her feet through the gap. She was lying on the bed I'd bought at SM City. I stood in my own hallway and counted 7 people. Rowena started to explain before I asked. She said Rodel had lost the work. She said the rental in Dumaguete, where he'd been staying, had fallen through. She said her mother's health had been worse, and it was too far to travel from Bayawan every time there was a problem. She said the house was sitting empty. She kept her voice very level the whole time she was saying this. She said, "It's still your house, Brendan." I remember thinking, past tense. I didn't shout. It's not my way. I said I needed a cup of tea, and I went into the kitchen, and Gina moved wordlessly to one side while I put the kettle on, and the 3-year-old made a sound in its sleep from the other room, and the basketball game carried on at a volume that felt slightly too loud for everything that was happening. I sat at my own kitchen table and drank my tea while Rowena's family moved around me. The boys eventually went to sleep on the floor of the living room. Rodel turned the television off and nodded at me in a way that I think was supposed to be apologetic or respectful or both. He called me Kuya, same as the first time. Rowena sat across from me after everyone else had gone to sleep. We didn't have the main conversation that night. I wasn't ready for it, and I think she knew that. She just sat there, and the house was quiet, and outside the rooster from 2 doors down was already starting its nonsense at some terrible hour of the morning. And I sat in the house I'd built and tried to work out how to feel about something that didn't have a clean name in any language I spoke. The conversation happened the next morning. Rodel took the boys out early, said something about visiting a cousin, which may have been true, or may have been Rowena asking him to make himself scarce. His wife, Gina, went with them. The mother stayed in the second bedroom. I could hear the television in there, low volume, some morning program. Rowena made coffee. She put it in front of me without being asked and sat across the table, and we looked at each other the way two people look at each other when they both know what the conversation has to be, and neither particularly wants to start it. I asked her how long Rodell had been here. She said since the 5th of December. 2 weeks before I arrived. I said, "Did you think about telling me?" She said she'd thought about it. That was the most honest exchange we had. She explained it the way she'd started explaining the night before, but more fully now. Rodell's work had collapsed on short notice. His landlord in Dumaguete had given him a week to leave, and he had nowhere to go with 3 children and a wife, and his mother needing more care than she could get in Bayawan. Rowena had a house with 2 bedrooms sitting empty. In the world she came from, the calculation wasn't complicated. You don't put your brother in a hotel. You don't leave your mother in a house she can't manage alone. The house was available. She had the key. So she used it. I said, "It's not your house." And she said, quietly, not defensively, just stating a fact as she understood it. She said, "I know. But you weren't here." I've thought about that sentence quite a lot since. I don't think she meant it as a justification, exactly. I think she meant it as a description of the situation as it appeared to her. He wasn't here. The house was empty. Her family needed it. And in the value system she'd grown up inside, the idea that a house should sit vacant while your brother's children had nowhere to sleep is not a thing that computes. It's not selfishness. It's a different set of priorities, arranged in a different order. I understand that now better than I did sitting at that kitchen table. But understanding something doesn't mean you can live inside it. I stayed 3 days. I slept in the main bedroom, which Rodell and Gina vacated without complaint, and without being asked, which I'll give them. I ate meals that Rowena cooked, which were good. She made a chicken tinola one evening, ginger broth with green papaya, the kind of thing that would fix anything on a different occasion. I was polite to everyone. It's how I was raised. You're polite, even when everything is wrong. On the second day, I spoke to Rowena alone again. I asked her one question. I said, "Did you plan this? Any of it? From the beginning?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't plan anything, but I also didn't stop it. And that's the answer that has stayed with me. Because it's not a confession, and it's not a denial. It's something more complicated than either." She didn't set a trap for a grieving Irish roofer with a bit of money. I believe that. But when the situation developed, she made choices. And those choices consistently put her family ahead of the understanding she and I had built. Maybe that's what love looks like in a family culture I didn't fully understand. Maybe it's something else. I genuinely cannot tell you which. On the 3rd day, I packed my bag and told her I needed time. She didn't argue. I think she'd been waiting for me to go. I checked into a guest house on the boulevard. A different one, not the place where we'd met. I spent 2 weeks in Dumaguete, doing practical things. I found a solicitor in Cebu City who handled property disputes involving foreign nationals, a woman named Atiti Santos, who had dealt with versions of my situation before and was neither surprised by it nor particularly sympathetic. She explained my position in about 20 minutes. The land was registered in Rowena's name. The house was on that land. I had no paper trail establishing my financial contribution, no loan agreement, no cohabitation contract, no notarized deed of acknowledgement. Without those, proving my claim in a Philippine court would be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain. She quoted me $180,000 to $250,000, $2,900 to $4,000 just to begin the process with no guarantee of outcome. I thanked her and told her I'd think about it. I have not called her back. The total I spent: land at P1.1 Abril Tours, I 9.1 million, construction at P2.1 million, fittings and appliances at P4 $80,000, the mother's roof repair at P 45,000, and the informal day-to-day support over 14 months at roughly 200,000. All in, just under 3.93 million. About $62,800 gone. The house is there. My name is on nothing. I have about $88,000 left from the sale of the Roscommon house, and I have my pension. I'm not destitute. Other men on this channel have lost more. I know that, and I'm not pretending otherwise. I flew back to Ireland in January 2024. I'm renting a flat in Athlone now, 10 minutes from Margaret. She comes for dinner on Sundays and doesn't say I told you so, which is decent of her because she absolutely told me so. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then, and I'll say it as plainly as I can because that's the only reason I'm telling any of this. A house in someone else's name is their house, not yours, not morally yours, not practically yours, not in any way that a court will care about. I knew the law. I thought trust was a substitute for legal protection. It isn't. It was never going to be. Slow doesn't mean safe. I told myself the pace of the relationship was evidence of its honesty. It might have been, but slowness and honesty are different things, and I confused them. Filipino family obligation is real. It's not a script or a strategy. It's a genuine system with its own logic and its own morality. But if you don't understand that system before you put 60,000 euro into the ground inside it, you will learn it the hard way. That's not their fault. It's yours. And the last thing, the thing I keep coming back to at 3 in the morning with the Athlone rain on the window. Grief is not a reason to stay in Roscommon, but it's also not a compass. It points toward warmth and calls it home. And I built a house on the strength of that pointing and put it in someone else's name, and then I went back to Ireland for a month and expected it to wait for me. I'm 59 years old. I spent 40 years putting roofs over other people's heads, and I thought I understood what it meant to build something. Turns out I was only ever good at the physical part. That's Brendan's story, and we're grateful he was willing to tell it. There's a legal reality at the heart of what you just heard that we want to be direct about, because it affects every foreigner considering property in the Philippines. You cannot own land here. That law exists, and it will not bend for sentiment, for love, for trust, or for the fact that you paid for every brick. If you are going to invest in property with a Filipino partner, you need a notarized financial contribution agreement, at minimum. You need independent legal advice from a solicitor with no connection to the person you're buying with. And you need to have that conversation before the money moves, not after. Brendan didn't do those things, and $62,800 is now a house he'll never sleep in again. If you're somewhere in the middle of a story that sounds like his, the build is underway, the land is in her name, you're telling yourself it's fine because you trust her. Please pause. Get the paperwork sorted. It costs a fraction of what you stand to lose, and it won't damage a genuine relationship to do it. If she objects to a legal agreement that simply acknowledges your contribution, that's the answer you needed. Thanks for watching Inside the Philippines. If this story helped you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it. And if you've got your own story you want to tell, the contact details are in the description below. We'll see you next time.